Hey everyone, welcome to PsychSphere. So, in today's lesson, we're starting from the foundation of everything in psychology. Now, before we jump into the brain, behavior, or neuroscience, we need to understand one thing very clearly. What is psychology and how do we study it scientifically? By the end of this video, you won't just memorize definitions, you will actually understand how psychologists think, how research works, and how human behavior is actually explained. So, let's get started. All right, let's begin with the most important foundation of what psychology actually is. Well, psychology is the scientific study of behavior, thought, and experience. Now, I don't want you to just memorize that definition, I want you to understand it. And when we say behavior, we're talking about anything you do, like walking, talking, studying, or even scrolling on your phone. And when we say thought, we're referring to what's happening inside your mind, your decisions, problem solving, your inner voice, basically. And when we say experience, we mean your emotions and perceptions on how you feel and how you interpret the world. Now, here's where it gets really important. Well, none of these happen in isolation. Your behavior, thoughts, and experiences are constantly being shaped by the three major influences: your biology, which is your brain, genes, hormones; your psychology, which is your personality, your memories, emotions; and your social environment, which is your family, culture, and surroundings. So, psychology is not just about the brain, it's about the interaction between your brain, your mind, and your environment that is working all together. And that's what makes psychology so powerful, which helps us understand why people think, feel, and behave the way they do. Okay, now that we understand what psychology studies, the next question is, how do psychologists actually study it? Well, this is where the scientific method comes in. Think of this as a structured way of discovering the truth. And it always begins with an observation. You notice something interesting. So let's say, for example, you might notice that students who sleep more seem to perform better in exams. From that observation, you develop something called a theory, which is a general explanation like sleep improves memory. Then comes the hypothesis, which is a specific testable prediction. For example, if students sleep 8 hours, their test scores will increase. Then you test it through experiments or research. Now, here's the key idea. I really want you to remember in science, we do not prove things. We never, ever, ever prove things. We either support a hypothesis or we reject it. And even if something is supported, it can still change with new evidence. That's what makes science reliable. It's always open to improvement. Now let's slow down here because many students often confuse these two concepts, which is hypothesis versus theory. Well, a hypothesis is a specific prediction that you can actually test. It's like a question you're trying to answer but using evidence. For example, if I exercise daily, my mood will improve. Now, moving on to theory. A theory, on the other hand, is much bigger. It's not a guess, it's actually a well supported explanation based on a large amount of research. For example, theories about memory or learning are built from hundreds of studies. So think of it like this: a hypothesis is one small testable idea, while a theory, on the other hand, is the big picture that explains many findings. And theories helps us generate new hypotheses, so the cycle continues. Okay, so now let's see what correlation is. And this is one of the most misunderstood concepts. Well, correlation is simply a relationship between two variables. If both variables increase together, that's a positive correlation. For example, more study time means and higher grades. And if one increases and the other decreases, that's a negative correlation. And a perfect example would be more stress and lower sleep quality. But here's the most important rule: And I want you to really remember this, that correlation does not mean causation. Just because two things are related does not mean one caused the other. There could be a third factor influencing both. And this is one of the biggest mistakes people make, even in real life. Okay, so now let's talk about something that can be very misleading, and that's called pseudoscience. And pseudoscience, it looks like science, it uses scientific language, but it doesn't follow the scientific methods. And it doesn't test the ideas properly, and it often ignores the evidence. And a classic example is phrenology, which claimed that personality could be determined by the bumps on the skull, which is very funny, and it sounds convincing to some people, but it has no real scientific support. So, whenever you hear a claim, ask yourself first, is this backed up by evidence or it just sounds scientific? Okay, so now we're moving into one of the most important frameworks in psychology, which is called the biopsychosocial model. I know that's a big word. And so this model explains that behavior is never caused by just one thing. Instead, it comes from the interaction of the three systems, which is number one, biological factors, two, psychological factors, and three, social factors. So starting from number one, biological factors, it's your brain activity, genetics, and hormones, while psychological factors is your thoughts, emotions, personality. And last but not least, the social factors, which is, of course, your family, culture, and environment. So let's say if someone is feeling very anxious, it could be due to the brain chemistry, negative thinking patterns, and social stress, all at the same time. So behavior is always a combination and not just a single cause. Okay, moving on. Psychology doesn't just give you knowledge, it changes how you think. So, scientific literacy means being able to understand, evaluate, and apply these scientific information. And it includes understanding the concepts, explaining them, thinking critically, and using them in real life. Now, critical thinking is especially important. It means questioning information, being curious, and not just blindly accepting everything you hear. Even if it sounds convincing, don't ever just blindly accept everything that you hear. And a good psychology student doesn't just memorize, they question and analyze. So, if you guys have any questions for me, please do write them down in the comments and I will definitely answer you guys. Okay, so now let's go into two core philosophical ideas behind psychology. First, empiricism. This means knowledge comes from observation and experience. But here's the limitation: our senses can sometimes be misleading too. And second, we have determinism, which means that every behavior has a cause and nothing happens randomly. There's always something behind it. Together, these ideas makes psychology both scientific and explainable. Okay, so now we enter a really fascinating area of psychology called the psychophysics. This field is all about understanding how the physical world outside of you becomes the mental experience inside your mind. So let's break it down. So every second, your body is receiving physical energy from the environment, like light waves, sound waves, pressure on your skin, even chemical molecules for taste and smell. But here's the important question: how does something physical, like light, turn into something subjective, like seeing color? That transformation is exactly what psychophysics studies. For example, light enters your eyes and hits the retina, where specialized cells convert that light into electrical signals. Those signals then travel to the brain, and your brain interprets them as shapes, colors, and movement. But here's where it gets really interesting. The brain doesn't just record reality, it interprets it. That means what you experience is not always a perfect copy of the outside world. So, for instance, two people can look at the same brightness of light, but one might perceive it as brighter than the other. Or think about sound. At what point does a sound become loud enough for you to notice it? So, psychophysics studies things like the absolute threshold, which is the minimum intensity needed to detect a stimulus, and the difference threshold, which is the smallest change you can notice between the two stimuli. So, for example, how much louder does music need to get before you notice the difference? Not just a huge jump, it's just a small measurable change. And here's a powerful idea. Your perception is shaped not just by the stimulus, but by your brain's interpretation, attention, and past experiences. So, psychophysics is really the bridge between the physical world and your psychological experience. It shows us that reality is not just what's out there, it's also how your brain constructs it. All right, so now that we have built a strong scientific foundation, let's step back for a moment and look at how people originally tried to understand behavior before psychology became a science. Because, believe it or not, humans have always been curious about why we act the way we do. And one of the earliest thinkers was Hippocrates. He believed that our personality and behavior were controlled by four bodily fluids, what he called humerus. So, for example, if someone had more blood, they were seen as energetic and cheerful. And if someone had more black bile, they were considered more sad or depressed. And then later, Galen of Pergamon took this idea further and turned it into personality types like sanguine, choleric, melancholic, and phlegmatic. Now, scientifically, we know today that these ideas are not correct. But here's what I want you to really understand. This was one of the first times people tried to explain behavior using the body instead of myths or supernatural forces. So even though they were wrong, they were incredibly important in moving thinking toward science. And from here, psychology slowly began to evolve. Now, building on that shift towards science, we move to one of the most influential figures ever, named Charles Darwin. Darwin introduced the idea of natural selection, which basically means traits that help survive are more likely to be passed on to the for future generations. And now, at first, this was about physical traits, but here's where psychology comes in. Behavior also evolves. Think about fear. Why are humans naturally afraid of things like snakes, heights, or loud noises? Because those fears helped our ancestors survive. Even things like emotions, memories, bonding with others, these are not random. They have evolved because they served a purpose. So, what Darwin did was shift psychology into a new direction. That behavior is not just happening, it has been shaped over time to help us adapt. And that idea still influences the modern psychology today. All right, before we move further, we need to understand one of the first scientific approaches in psychology called structuralism. Well, this idea was developed by Edward Titchener. Now, structuralism was based on a very simple question: what is the mind made of? Titchener believed that just like chemistry breaks things down into elements, we should break the mind down into its most basic components like sensations, thoughts, and feelings. To study this, he used a method called introspection where people would carefully describe their own conscious experiences. So, for example, instead of just saying, I see an apple, they would describe it, its color, the texture, the brightness, the shape, and every tiny detail. Now, this was important because it was one of the first attempts to study the mind scientifically. But there was a problem. Different people described experiences differently, so it wasn't very reliable. And that led psychologists to ask a new question. Instead of, what is the mind made of? Maybe we should ask, what does the mind do? And we have another German psychologist named Wilhelm. I really don't know how you say his last name. So he was the first person to study the mind scientifically. And in 1879, he opened the first psychology lab, which officially made psychology a science. He used controlled experiments like measuring reaction times to understand how quickly people respond to stimuli. He also used the same method, the introspection method, to study conscious experience, but in a more structured and controlled way than before. Okay, so now let's talk about functionalism. This approach was developed by William James. Instead of focusing on structure, James asked, what is the purpose of the mind and behavior? So rather than breaking things down, he looked at how mental processes help us adapt and survive in real life. For example, why do we feel fear? Not just what fear is, but what it does. Fear helps you respond to danger, of course. Memory helps you learn from past experiences. Attention helps you focus on what matters. So, functionalism is about the function and not the structure. And this idea connects strongly with Darwin's theory because both focus on survival and, and adaptation. So, you can see how psychology is evolving. Okay, so now let's move into something much more internal and psychological. This is where Sigmund Freud comes in. Freud introduced the idea that a large part of our behavior is controlled by the unconscious mind, meaning there are thoughts, desires, and memories influencing you that you're not even aware of. So, for example, have you ever reacted emotionally to something and later thought, why did I even react like that? Well, Freud would say that's because of the hidden internal conflicts or past experiences that are stored in the unconscious. His method was called psychoanalysis that aimed to bring those hidden thoughts into awareness so people could better understand themselves. Now, not all Freud's ideas are accepted today, but one idea remains extremely powerful. We are not fully aware of everything that influences our behavior. And that idea continues to shape our modern psychology. Okay, so after focusing so much on the unconscious mind, psychologists began to question something really important. How can we study something we can't see? And this led to the rise of behaviorism. So the behaviorists believed we should only study the observable behavior, things we can measure and see. And one of the key figures here was the Ivan Pavlov. He showed that learning happens through association. A common example is that if a dog hears a bell before the food repeatedly, it will eventually start salivating just from the bell alone. Then John B. Watson took this idea further and applied it to humans. He believed that behavior is shaped entirely by the environment. So, according to behaviorism, everything you do is learned from your surroundings and not from your internal thoughts. But then psychologists realized something really important, that behavior is not just about association, it's also about consequences. And now that brings us to B.F. Skinner. So, Skinner showed that behavior is shaped by what happens after the behavior. So, if a behavior is followed by a reward, it becomes stronger. But if it's followed by a punishment, it becomes weaker. So, for example, if you study hard and get good grades, you're more likely to study again. But if you touch something hot and get burned, you're less likely to do it again. This is called operant conditioning, which is learning through consequences. And once you understand this, you will start seeing it everywhere in school, parenting, workplaces, even social media. But then again, psychology shifted because scientists realize we still can't ignore the mind. Now, let's talk about the law of effect introduced by Edward Thorndike. Now, instead of thinking about simple rewards and punishments like we did earlier, I want you to think about how your brain naturally keeps track of what works and what doesn't. So, Thorndike discovered this through experiments with animals, especially cats placed in puzzle boxes. So, at first, the cat would try random actions like scratching and pushing and moving around, but eventually it would accidentally press a lever and escape. Now, here's the key part. Over time, the cat stopped doing those random behaviors and started going straight to the action that worked. So, what does this tells us? Again, the brain gradually strengthens behavior that lead to successful outcomes even if the learning starts by accident. Now, let's bring this to the real life but in a different way than before. Think about social situations. If you say something in a group and people laugh or respond positively, your brain marks that behavior as good, and you're more likely to speak up again. But if you say something and get ignored or awkward silence, your brain actually pulls back. You become less likely to repeat that behavior. So, what's happening here is not just reward or punishment, it's your brain constantly shaping your behavior based on the past outcomes, often without you even noticing it. And this is why Thorndike is so important. He showed that learning is not just immediate, it's gradual based on experiences and built over time. And later, psychologists like B.F. Skinner, that we talked about in the previous slide, he took this idea and developed it into a more structured system. So think of Thorndike as the one who discovered the pattern and Skinner as the one who explained it in detail. All right, now psychology takes an important turn here. So, behaviorism was focused only on observable behavior, but psychologists later realized something was missing. So, we can't ignore what's happening inside the mind. So, this led to cognitive psychology, which studies mental processes like thinking, memory, attention, and decision making. So instead of just asking, what do people do? We now ask, how does the brain process information to produce that behavior? Well, Erlich Nasser was also known as the father of cognitive psychology. He helped introduce this idea by comparing the brain to a computer, which is taking in the information like input and then processing it, storing it, and then using it to guide our actions. So, behavior is not just a reaction, it's the result of internal thinking processes. Okay, so now we enter what's called the cognitive revolution, where psychologists brought the mind back into focus. So researchers like Herman, he studied how memory works. He discovered the forgetting curve, showing that we forget information quickly at first, then more slowly over time. Then another psychologist named Frederick, he showed that something even more interesting, that memory is not exact. It changes based on your experiences, beliefs, and culture. And from here, psychology began to focus not just on problems, but also on human potential. Okay, so now we connect everything we have learned to the biological level. Donald Hebb introduced one of the most important ideas in neuroscience, where he said neurons that fire together wire together. What this means is that when two brain cells are activated at the same time repeatedly, their connection becomes stronger. So, for example, when you practice something like studying or learning a skill, those neural connections strengthen over time. That's why practice actually changes your brain physically. So, learning is not just something abstract, it's a real biological process happening inside your brain. Okay, so now this brings us to a much more positive perspective, which is, sorry, humanistic psychology. So, psychologists like Abraham and Carl Rogers believe that humans are not just controlled by biology or environment. We also have free will. They focused on growth, meaning, and becoming the best version of yourselves. So instead of asking what's wrong with people, they asked, how can people grow, improve, and reach their full potential? And this shift is important because it changes how we see human behavior from something controlled to something meaningful and purposeful. Now, let's look at how your behavior is influenced by the people around you. Kurt Lewin introduced a very powerful idea that behavior is a function of the person and the environment. So it's not just who you are, it's also where you are and who you are with. Then Norman Triplett showed that people perform better when others are around. For example, a cyclist ride faster when competing against others compared to riding alone. And this shows that social situations can change how you behave, and often without you even realizing it. And finally, to truly understand behavior, we have to connect all of this back to the brain itself. Okay, so now let's bring everything we have learned into the real world. This is where applied psychology comes in. So, applied psychology is about using psychological principles to solve real life problems. So, instead of just studying behavior, we ask, how can we use this knowledge to improve people's lives? Well, there are many areas within applied psychology. For example, industrial organizational psychology, it focuses on the workplace, improving productivity, motivation, and employee well-being. And human factor psychology focuses on designing tools and systems that are safe and easy to use, like making car dashboards or airplane controls more user friendly. So, psychology is not just theory, it has real practical impact. So, from education to mental health to business and to technology. And psychology is everywhere. So now you understand how psychology developed from early ideas to modern science. And if this helped you, please subscribe to PsychSphere and comment what you want next. I'll see you guys in the next lesson. Thanks for watching.